Well, welcome to the Looking Glass Season 2 for the interviews, and today we've got John Loeffler, and I want to thank John Loeffler for coming in. How are you doing, John?
I am doing still above room temperature.
I hear that you've hung up the mic.
I guess so. I mean, I've hung up the mic in terms of a daily podcast and a weekend syndicated radio show, and now I'm taking a little time off and asking the Lord what he wants me to do to go on, because I'm not the type to retire and play golf. But the grind of doing news shows, I've been doing that for 32 years, and it is a grind. I was on the air one time. It was amazing, Josh. We had our show was a live 2-hour daily show in Colorado, and I'm arguing with this caller on the air about something, and we always argued politely. We didn't treat anybody badly. And he finally says, "Well, I wish I had a cushy job like you talking on the radio." And I looked at my producer and my engineer through the glass like, something like that. And I said, "Cushy, I go from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, 6 days a week to make a 5-day-a-week, a 2-hour-a-day news talk program go. There's nothing cushy about it. It's highly stressing."
Yeah, I've definitely come to find that out. I mean, because in order to say something intelligent, you have to put something intelligent into your brain.
Right.
And so there's a lot of research.
They think you just sit there, a lot of people, and you just sit down, open up the newspaper. Well, what did the mayor do this morning? Or what did the governor do? And you just blab your ideas out. No, that's not how it happens. At least not if it's a show worth listening to.
No. And if someone could do that, they would be an absolute genius. I mean, the stuff, even just preparing for this one, I did at least, I think, about 6 hours worth of reading, and I'm not a fast reader. It's a big job, and I don't think people really understand, because for them it might be just infotainment.
For a lot of people it is. The great Rush Limbaugh here used to always remind us that it was all entertainment. I didn't quite agree with that. I have always believed in the power of media to shape what men and women think. So it was something a lot more than that.
In Australia at the moment, and you might not know, but we're going through a lot of, I want to say destabilization, but I don't want to get too political. Well, we're going through a lot of changes, a lot of potential changes. And one of the things that we're going to have to think about pretty quickly is our constitution. Now, in Australia, we have a constitution. I read through it. It's not like the American Constitution. It's a lot smaller in scope, and it wasn't created from a conflict. It was more created out of necessity, in that, we have these 5 or 6 states, these colonies of Britain, and, how are we going to deal with an army? I mean, we can't raise an army ourselves that's big enough to do anything, so maybe we should have come together and create an army that way. What about international trade? What about the money system? All these sorts of questions were the things that brought the states in Australia together to form a constitution. So as a consequence, it is a very light document, and it simply talks about who has what powers, things about taxation. There's really nothing like, say, the Bill of Rights. I think the only clause in it that has any direct implication to the people is that we have a clause where it says that government are prohibited from establishing or enforcing a religion, and that there should be no religious tests for office. So it's similar to part of your First Amendment.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. You were going to say something?
Well, remember that the Bill of Rights was a later add-on to the Constitution, because there were a number of representatives in 1789 that really believed that, or was it 1787? Sorry, that they weren't strong enough, and they wanted to put in absolutes there. Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to bear arms, right to be secure in your persons, papers, and possessions, no double jeopardy, no being forced to testify against yourself, habeas corpus. They couldn't hold you indefinitely without charging you or releasing you. And because these were all the things that King George had done to the colonists here. And they just wanted to put those in there. And as I've said, it's a firewall. It's a one-way wall. It's a prohibition upon government from encroaching. And of course, today, that's what government is doing, nothing but encroaching all over the place.
So let's back up, and the historical context of the US Constitution. Can you sort of help us Australians and anyone listening understand what was the historical context that gave rise to the original signing of the US Constitution?
And I commend you that you didn't say we Australians. So an object of a sentence that you would help us Australians. The context that happened, obviously the British Empire extended over quite a bit of the world. Australia, New Zealand, what were the colonies here, including Canada, both the U.S. and Canada. And I'm trying to think of something else. I know I missed something in my mind there. Sorry, it's late in our day here. And we had been part of the British Empire for a long time, for several centuries, between, say, about 1620 and finally we achieved independence. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. So it's interesting that there were whole generations of people that had grown up here that were British subjects, but they'd never been to Great Britain, you know. And what began to happen through various means is that the tensions between Parliament in Great Britain and the colonists in the United States just grew and grew and grew until the colonists felt that they were being badly abused, that they were not properly represented in Parliament, which is where we came up with the no taxation without representation. And I guess the straw that broke the camel's back was the tea tax that the British Parliament at the time put on tea. And what British subject doesn't drink tea, right? And that resulted in what became to be known as the Boston Tea Party, where in Boston, they went down and they took this whole shipload of tea and threw it in Boston Harbor. I don't know if they had fortune tellers that could read harbors at the time, but that might have been worth it. But that was what kicked it off, and then the British decided to crack down. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, for 10 years, had been doing shuttle diplomacy between, across the ocean, and it took, three months to get across. I can't remember, 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on the winds, and trying to get Parliament to give them some concessions. And it didn't work. Parliament just became more and more arrogant about the Americans. I think they saw them as second-class citizens. And finally, at that point, the colonies, 13 of them, got together and said, okay, that's enough. We're declaring our independence from Great Britain. And in doing that, by the way, they were actually laying the groundwork, as I told a friend of mine from New Zealand when we were talking about Waitangi Day. I said, well, you know why the Crown didn't put up a fuss about New Zealand getting home rule? And he said, no, why? And I said, because the United States had done your heavy lifting for you. We'd fought the British twice, in 1776 and in the War of 1812. And by that time, the Crown was running out of money, and they just weren't up for another battle with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, but all of those countries remained Commonwealth countries, whereas we were the only ones that I could think of that became really independent, maybe aside from South Africa, because it was a mixture of Boers and British subjects, etc. So that's sort of the background. It's, you can go into a lot of that. It was born in rebellion. People had just finally said, that's enough. And it was also influenced by two things. Number one was the Protestant Reformation, remembering that the Reformation became something unique in England that it really wasn't in the rest of the continent. And people began to realize that we've got to stop killing each other over our different Christian beliefs, even within Protestant sects like Puritans, who really wanted to go back to the pure gospel. The Anglicans wanted to reform a bit, but retain most of what the Roman Church had been, dealt with in liturgy and practice. And so that played a major role in the ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. The second set of ideas were those of Rousseau and Voltaire, which ultimately resulted in the French Revolution. They were different ideas, and our founders, Jefferson was a big fan of this, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is a marvelous piece of philosophical treaty reflecting the philosophical thought of the time. But we rejected that, and thankfully we did, because the French Revolution started out by saying there is no God, God's totally out, and if we just let the gentle citizen come out, the problem with mankind is religion, and if we took off the religious suppression, then everything would be fine. Well, after they got done taking the lid off, how many 30,000 people died at the guillotine, being drowned, shot as a result of the French Revolution, and every Marxist revolution ever since then. That was the granddaddy of all Marxist revolutions. The American settlers rejected that. They started with the idea that it had to be founded on a belief in God for its moral system, but that also mankind had an innate sense of evil. In other words, the gospel tells us what? Every man's heart is dark, right? It's evil. It does no good. There's nothing righteous before God. And so they understood that powers had to be broken up. This was a whole new experiment. And so they created a legislative branch in the Congress, and there was an executive branch under the president, and then the judicial branch to arbitrate. And each of the branches was equal and could offset the other. It was an attempt to divide this power up. So in the history of the world, it's a rather unique experiment. I'm not sure it's going to succeed or last, but we'll see.
Well, I think the famous quote was someone asked someone that you would probably know, what type of government
Benjamin Franklin, yeah.
Yeah, what type of government have you given us? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it.
Right.
Yes, so that's interesting. So it was really a disagreement, first a grievance and then a disagreement. So, in other words, we don't feel like we're being treated fairly by the mainland British in their parliament, and we've had enough of this. There are other reasons, religious reasons that we have that we want to separate, and so that you're saying that basically caused the or had the impetus to move to an independence.
That's correct. That was the flowing issue, the issue that almost scuttled the creation of the new country during the time of the Declaration in 1775-76 was slavery, because the southern colonies engaged in slavery, the northern colonies did not. And it actually came up during the debates over what would go into and what would go out of this Declaration of Independence, etc., especially since Jefferson, who himself owned slaves, was saying that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. They had to shelve that. It'd be another 80 years later before we settled it again with the Civil War, over which the issue was secession. Since all of the colonies had come in voluntarily, did they have the right to leave this union voluntarily? The South said yes, the North said no. That's what the Civil War was fought about. And unlike in the British Empire, where just through the efforts of William Wilberforce in Parliament, he managed over the course of a lifetime to actually get Parliament to abolish the slave trade for all of the Commonwealth. In the United States, we're ornery. I don't know, that's a word that most Australians don't know, I guess. It's a Western term for like cowboys, and that is, if you say go do something, the response is, why should I? Or make me. Or them's fighting words. And Americans just tend to be ornery. And we still are today. It's like God made the Jews a hard-necked people, right? A friend of mine from Israel says, God made us the hard-necked people, and so we are. It's what we are today. I maintain all the loyalists went to Canada. And that's why you see the difference today. We're very Puritan, even in our atheism, very Puritan in our outlook. And we tend to be contrarian to anything that people try to foist on us. That's been changed now, of course, due to this creeping cultural Marxism, which is infecting all of the English language world.
So
yeah.
you've got the Constitution. So for us Australians, sometimes we can get confused about things. So you have the Declaration of Independence, which is the statement of independence from Britain and the colonies. And then you have
Right.
the US Constitution, which was written later, that we've talked about already. And then you had later still, not too long later, I think about 5 or 10 years, I can't remember, but you had the Bill of Rights. And that was championed by a guy called Madison. Is that right?
Yes, James Madison, right.
So under what
and
circumstances did they think, hey, we need a Bill of Rights? Because it is kind of unique.
The first thing, Declaration of Independence was 1776. After the War of Independence, when the British surrendered, then we had to try to get along. And so we had sort of the Articles of Confederation is what it was called. That wasn't working. And so they knew they needed something stronger. Then the debate was, where will the power ultimately lie? In the federal government or in the states? And the Bill of Rights came along to clearly and overtly declare what the rights and limitations of the government are. And I always point out today, like when people today talk about the separation of church and state, I say that's not in the Constitution. It never was. It was not intended. Our Bill of Rights says two things. Congress will not make any law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. It says nothing about religion influencing government, which the founders had intended. But maybe the 10th Amendment was really the clearest. And it says those powers not specifically granted to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. And that made states' rights clear, that these were sovereign, independent states which federalized together to handle those things as a country, but otherwise everything else would be left up to the states. Now, of course, this is totally scrambled today. We've come a far way from what the founders intended, and yet the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is still there. You know, it hasn't gone away. It's just that nobody seems to read these things anymore and observe them.
Yeah. So I read also Magna Carta, which a lot of people say is the foundation of freedom. And I listened to some commentary on the Magna Carta by David Starkey, who's a British historian. And so the Magna Carta seems to be a treaty of some sort between King John and
Yes.
the barons, the land barons, in about, I think it's 1215.
That's about right. I
And
can't remember exactly.
it went nowhere. It was a toothless document that was annulled later, but it was reissued after a revamp by a guy called Archbishop Langton, who was, from my understanding, the first biblical scholar who started using the Bible to think about politics. And he was exegeting the Bible to come up with a philosophy of how should Christians govern. Do you know much about that?
No, I if you had told me ahead of time, I would have prepped just a bit. All right. But remember, everything has come about in stages.
Yeah,
okay?
true.
Right about the same time, Thomas Aquinas was writing. And Thomas Aquinas and some of the other scholastics of his time formulated the basis of what later became Roman Catholic dogma that was adopted into Catholicism, which was the reigning religion of the time, okay? Even though you periodically had a few people that came along who were already saying, wait a minute, we've drifted far from the scriptures, we need to get back to the scriptures, like Wycliffe, say, for example. There's a good point on that. But everything happens in stages. Which is why it's absurd today. You see people saying, well, they should have known 200 years ago that slavery was wrong, and anything that they said, the product of white racist slave owners can't possibly be good. Well, that's nonsense, because where we are today is built on all of the hard philosophical and theological and political work that these people did over the centuries. So Great Britain went through a series of stages in converting its country from a monarchy to much more of a parliamentarian system, limiting the powers of the monarch. And then they came up with the idea of the balances, because remember, as you said, the Magna Carta was a treaty between the king and between the barons at the time. They were tired of getting bossed around by the king who wasn't listening to them, but ain't nobody there that cared about the serfs, right?
Yeah.
Well, later on, you came along with the idea of the House of Commons, the House of Lords. So everybody was represented in Parliament and had a voice. Same thing here in our country. You have a Congress, and it's split between the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the Senate, every state gets 2 votes. In the House of Representatives, the votes are by population. So that was because the smaller states realized that they were just going to be overrun by the will of the larger states. And they said, phooey on that. Well, the larger states didn't want the smaller states to necessarily tell them what to do. So that was the compromise. Let's do it that way. Very much after the 2 chambers of Parliament in Great Britain.
Yeah, so I also read that in the 1700s, which is around in the late 1700s is where the Bill of Rights was put together, there was a lot of discussion about studying the Magna Carta, and they came out with 3 fundamental rights: the right to life, liberty, and property. And I know that Frederick Bastiat uses those 3 to talk about liberty, to talk about, I suppose, his answer or his rebuttal to socialism. Was there any evidence that the people who were developing the Bill of Rights had any intellectual connection to the 1700 scholars in Britain that were talking about these things?
They were very well aware of all of that. That was very much the discussion of the day if you go and read their papers. And when I went through Monticello, which is the home of Thomas Jefferson, and it was interesting because I would hang back at the tour. You know, they would go in groups through the house. And I would hang back, and going through his library, instead of listening to the tour guide, I was reading the books he had on his shelf and which languages they were written in, because he was fluent in French as well as English. So they were very much aware of the zeitgeist, you know, the philosophical ideas, both in Great Britain and in France at the time. And they had just come out of the Protestant Reformation less than, let's say, 1517 was Luther's 95 Theses. Council of Trent was 1545. So just bump it up 2 centuries. They were very, very aware of all of these theological and philosophical trends. And yes, that's what built into what they were writing.
So it's interesting that, what you said, there's things happen in stages, and we in the modern era, perhaps we're the only people that do this because of our access to information, but we tend to read our world and our definitions and our understandings back into history. Whereas when I talk to people who have either studied theology or study exegesis of the Bible or study history, they train themselves to think in terms of chronological progressions. And so you get a lot of... Sorry, go.
Which is how history actually happened.
Exactly.
And and today what they're doing is what I call a theological or legal readback. We try to read back our conclusions in the 21st century and impose them on people in the 18th century or the 19th century. Well, that's an absurdity. It doesn't happen like that. And I remember Professor Jason Hill. He's interesting. He's one of the ones that has opposed what I call hocus pocus over here. In that he's a black Jamaican immigrant to the United States, and he teaches philosophy, and he'll have students come into his class saying, well, we don't need to read, say, for example, John Locke or Descartes, because those are just dead white racist whatever they were, philosophers, economists, therefore, and the absurd conclusion is, oh, they have nothing to say to us. And he would say, why, you arrogant little, whatever. You wouldn't even have the ability to use the word racist if it were not for the work that these men had done. We built over time on these platforms. And the absurdity today is that anything, if you notice, the war is on Western civilization. That's what the war is on. And the Anglosphere, but also parts of Europe, Western Europe, we have been chewing out our own guts since World War II in academia, telling ourselves everything that's wrong with us. I don't know. In Australia, it looks like a lot of people are doing pretty well. Same as in the United States. Why is that? Because of free markets, because of the freedoms we established. And the people who generally talk about how bad the Western world, the Anglosphere, is a no good, very bad, perfectly racist, horrible, awful place. They need to go to third world countries. Take a look at how well Christians are getting along there. Look inside the Islamic world and see what goes on in there today in terms of rights, which is the real irony that the progressive left, which are really the neo-Marxist left, are making an alliance with the radical Islamists around the world. They have nothing in common except for one thing: hatred of Western civilization. And if they ever succeed in getting rid of that, they're going to have to duke it out with each other because they don't agree on anything. All of the rights that the progressive left keeps harping about, the fundamentalist Islamists who are terrorists and other groups, they hate those. They despise those, Like I said, there's no agreement between the two. It's a very rarity in this modern situation.
So in America's context, a constitution, if we go a little bit more general, a constitution is the solid rock foundation upon which legislative law happens. Is that an accurate understanding?
That's correct. It's your base law. It's your primary law. And all laws have to agree with that.
And so if we want to change the Constitution, what we're actually proposing is to change the foundation of a country, and it's not a trivial thing.
That's correct. We have proposals in this country for what we call a con-con. I forget how many states have issued a call for it. It has to be 2/3 of the state need to ratify a call for a constitutional convention, which either A, could be empowered or authorized to deal with only one issue, or B, and this is the area of debate, it could just become a freewheeling runaway in which they could just trash the whole current Constitution. And as I say, you look at the poor knowledge base of millennials today, say, for example. They are undereducated. They think themselves well-educated. They've been given a line of politically correct garbage, and that's all they know and understand. And if you took all of the wacky-dacky ideas about rights today that are running around and constantly changing, can you imagine trying to write all of that stuff into a constitution? The people today are not philosophically and politically well-grounded like the founders were in the spirit of the times, those ideas of both sides of the English Channel that you were talking about. So that's the difficulty. Now, you can amend a constitution. It's been done quite a few times. It can be done by a vote of the people. The states always have to refer to it. Congress can initiate it. There are several ways that it can be amended, but it ultimately has to be approved by 3/4 of the states before the amendment takes effect. The founders intended the Constitution to be difficult to change, so that it would not be subject to the buffeting that goes on from year to year and decade to decade in debates and things that people want. It was designed to be immune to that, but it's under pretty brutal attack right now.
I mean, that sounds perfectly reasonable and logical because, I mean, once you lay the foundation of a building, I mean, when an earthquake shakes it, the foundation, and it moves, everything that is built upon it is in jeopardy. And so the Constitution should be something that is written in such a way that it doesn't need changing. I mean, certain things may come up as time goes on, but ultimately you would try and write it in the way of intending it to be a long-term document.
That's right. But nobody can see the whole future except for God. Okay. And the founders understood that we might have to make some changes. So say, for example, we've made some good changes. We abolished slavery and established equal citizenship for everybody, regardless of race. So that was an important thing, 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. We tried prohibiting alcohol. We went through 10 years of that nonsense before they repealed that amendment. They put a curse upon the country when they enabled the income tax, which has been a curse ever since then, because there were much better ways to collect tax. And now Congress has the right to snoop on everything that we do. So, yeah, it can be done. And like we also limited by constitutional amendment the number of terms that someone could serve in the office of president. Before, it was unlimited. And the only president to hold 4 terms was Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II. Of course, he died in office just a short time after taking office in the 4th term. And at that point, they decided to limit it to 8 years, 2 terms.
Yeah, we have a limited duration before an election, but theoretically, if one party gets elected for the next 100 years, there's no limit to that, because ultimately the leader of the party in Australia is the Prime Minister, and you vote for the party, and the party then the promotes a leader, which is the Prime Minister of the country. In Australia, we have Indigenous people in Australia as part of our citizenry, as well as America does, and Canada does, and New Zealand does, and lots of countries do.
Yep.
They are proposing to put into our constitution something called a constitutional voice. And it seems like what is occurring is some people have called it apartheid, but I don't think that's an apt word. But it seems like what they're doing is creating a second parliament of Indigenous people who then speak to influence what goes on in policy. And they want to put that into the Constitution. It seems like, they want to set up an Aboriginal parliament that will speak, that is constitutionally recognised. And for me, that's really scary, because it seems to me that what is actually occurring, that might be a precursor to splitting the country, basically.
What authority, whenever a politician says something, you've got to ask 4 questions, okay? What does that mean? That's the first question. So you already named it there. Number 2, how will that be implemented or enforced? Number 3, is it voluntary or mandatory? And be careful of voluntary, because things have a way of being voluntarily mandatory. And number 4, who's going to pay for it? And so I would agree with you, because, the argument is always, whether it's Canada, the U.S., Australia, that, these people were here first and you all guys came in and pushed them aside, yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's go to Great Britain, okay? Who were there first? The Celts. What happened then? Well, then all of the Germanic-speaking people came in, the Anglo-Saxons, right? Whoop, they came in. They pushed the Celts out into Scotland, into Wales, and into Ireland. What happened after that? 1066, the Norman invasion. The French came over, and they forced their way in, and they took over the country. So, and that's where, by the way, that's where our English comes from, because our English, in about 200 years from from the invasion of Normandy, 1066, till about the time of Chaucer, 2 centuries later, became a mix of German, Celtic, French, and Latin. And that's why English is a crazy language today, because you've got 4 different sets of rules. But now that that's done, and that is the history of the world, if you look all around the world, it's the story of one tribe pushing into another tribe's area. But here we are today. And so you have Australia, you have people coming from all over the place. You have native groups that are there in Australia, but it's still one person, one vote. It's all one country now. How we got here is not that important. And so the question is, are they going to be like a lobbying group would be here in the United States, where certain groups and interests have a right to lobby Congress people? Or are they going to have a separate vote or veto power in there? It gets a little spooky, because then the people who aren't in that group will become resentful at some point or another.
Yeah, splitting people in terms of indigenous and non-indigenous ignores the fact that, we're a young country by world standards, but still 200 years old. That's a lot of generations. Personally, my ancestor came over on the First Fleet and has been part of building Australia since then. I mean, the first generation, the guy who came over was a bit of a ragamuffin, not someone I'm proud of. But after that, his son built communities and became an integral part of establishing a stable community in Tasmania. And, my mum's family name, who's from where that comes from, you can find it all over Tasmania, because these people established a home here. And so when we come to 2022 or 23, whenever they start to talk about this, to then go and split constitutionally the Indigenous from the so-called colonizers, or some people call them the invaders, you're really creating conflict.
You're creating. Now remember that is the goal of cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
Okay. The whole goal of cultural Marxism, which emanated from the mind of the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, and which was spread throughout the Western world by people fleeing from Germany, members of what was called the Frankfurt School, which was originally called the Institute for Marxist Research. They changed their name when they arrived in other countries, but that's it. And the goal today is to divide, even oftentimes in the name of unifying, to get groups mad at each other. This is called a dialectical process. So the groups are going back and forth, thinking that the problem is the other group, when in reality, they're being moved together to a third destination that most of the people don't suspect. And that's what's happening today. And so what you're doing is division. Over here, Black Lives Matter. Who is it founded by? Some avowed Marxists. What does it do? It divides. And so that's the problem that we have is, you're right. Some of your people came from one place. The natives came from another place. They didn't just start there. They had to come into that land at some point or another. But now what? Here we are, like you said, 200 years later. And in our case, it's almost 500 years later. We're all here. Same thing happened in Mexico. In Mexico, the Aztecs, called the Mexica, from which they get the word Mexico, had enslaved all of the native tribes around them. And they were using their men for human sacrifice to their gods, which is why when the Spaniards arrived with Cortez, the tribes were more than happy to ally with the Spaniards against Moctezuma and the Aztecs. And so even here in the United States, our own tribes in the southwest of the country had the Comanches and the Apaches, and they never got along with each other. In the northern part of the country, in my area here, we have the Lakota Sioux, and they were looked down upon by all the other tribes because they'd run around raiding the tribes, stealing the horses, kidnapping the women. Lewis and Clark expedition, the translator that went along, was a woman who had been kidnapped from her tribe, from the Shoshone tribe, and was eventually peddled off to a French trapper as her wife, and she became the translator for the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 to 1806, where they traveled all the way from the East Coast to the Pacific. So the idea that anybody has a sacred grab to the land, well, yes, sort of. There were places, if you want to go biblically, that God assigned to these different groups when they spread out. But the whole history of the world is one group pushing in on another group and trying to take their territory. But then afterwards, just like has happened in Great Britain, they merged. Okay, you had Anglo-Saxons, Normans, and after a couple of hundred years, all the distinctions dropped out, and they were all just what? Englanders. And that's how it runs. So today, why would you want to do that? Why are we suddenly going back to say, well, this group has a right to operate separately from that group? That's just breeding disaster, because that's what got our colonies going and up in an uproar, was the fact that the Brits kept treating us separately, and kept looking down upon us, and would not recognize. For a while there, we had home councils and able to do that, but I don't know. Remember that the goal of cultural Marxism, which has been chewing out the guts of Western civilization in our colleges and our schools for half a century, the goal is division and collapsing Western civilization. They hate it.
Yeah.
They just don't believe in it. Yeah.
Well, I think, James Lindsay has been, he runs an organization called New Discourses. I don't know if you know him or not.
Yes, I know of it.
He just did a fantastic summary of where Marxism is at the present moment, and he talks about the past and where it's come from, and he talks about it as actually a religion, in that it's a worldview that has supernatural elements, that also dictates or has a canon of morals. And he talks about Foucault, and Foucault had this idea of the noble savage.
Yes.
And so I think what's happened in Australia is the Marxist groups have selected decolonisation and queer theory as the two things they want to push through the wall to destroy the stability in Australia. And that's what it's been moving to. So those two ideas of decolonisation, lifting up the Aboriginals, who incidentally, there's people talking about Indigenous knowledge, how they have this mystical connection with the land, and so the land tells the knowledge is held in the land. And the land tells the Aboriginal what it's saying, and then the Aboriginal translates for the land. And so this has already been used, this idea has already been used in the most recent environmental impact study for Australia. So you've got a scientist and you've got an Aboriginal interpreting the land. And so that's what I think that this constitutional voice that they're trying to push through is. It's scientism, essentially, where you have these prophets that can only talk, are the only people that know or can talk to the land and then tell you where the land is sick from climate change. In the same way that scientists can talk to the universe and get information from the universe and tell us, how we should deal with the pandemic. I mean, this idea of scientism is really coming back in, which is, to me, amazing. It's amazing that this is happening today.
Well, and it's also, if you look at it from a spiritual perspective, who is the God of this world? And then where this information is coming from. Back before the turn of the 20th century, you had the sudden resurgence in Europe for a couple of decades before that of seancing and of occultism, like Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Alice A. Bailey, these names that were into occultism. We see where that led to a few decades later in both Marxism and in fascism in Nazi Germany. And the attack was on the church and on the rules and the ideas and the philosophies of the Christian worldview. That's where the attack is coming. So now you were right. It is a religion. It's a religious belief. But when they say science says, you hear that a lot today, you want to raise your hand and say, well, can I go talk to this Mr. or Mrs. Science?
Yeah, what's his address?
what's his address? I need to go talk to him. And they say, well, it's not a person, it's rather scientists. Well, then do they all agree? Well, now see, that's where the lying comes in. Because when it comes to anthropogenic global warming, they'll say, yes, the consensus is. What they don't tell you is that right from the get-go in the 1980s and 1990s, dissenting voices were suppressed. And they were suppressed both within the sciences and within the political process, in that if a climatologist said, no, I don't think it's that bad, his funding would dry up. I talked to Bill Gray, University of Colorado, and he said that's exactly what happened to him. So science today, whether it's COVID or whether it's global warming, which they remember, it was originally global warming, and they changed the name to hedge their bets, is what they did, to climate change. Science isn't saying that. It's a heavily politicized science, and where the money goes, that's where the studies grow, okay? So, yeah, and you're right, it's scientism, and you've very accurately pointed out, starting in the 60s and especially in the 80s, the scientism link, which supposedly is supposed to be atheistic, agnostic, and or logical, has actually joined hands with pantheism. And that's exactly what you're describing.
Yeah, and I always find it really funny, because the only time you would need to appeal in a scientific community to a consensus is if there isn't one.
That's correct. When you hear the overwhelming evidence shows, because that means you really don't have this proof tacked down. And they can't. As a matter of fact, the whole issue of the global warming thing, which is my pet peeve, is that not only are the real world statistics now, if you look at the graphs, that the panic graphs being generated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter like that. The real world is a much flatter curve, which means we have a lot of time. These people are running in right now telling us, Joshua, that we have to stop using fossil fuels immediately or the planet will be done for in 50 or 100 years. Okay, well, what are you going to replace that with? Everything. I don't know if you've looked around you there in Australia, but everything runs on fossil fuels. So they sort of come out and say wind and solar. We already know those industries are not ready for prime time. They can't hack it. And electric cars. Oh, good. Well, you need petroleum to manufacture those electric cars and all of the high tech that goes into those electric cars. And, oh, by the way, did you happen to think about what's going to charge those electric cars at night? Oh, my, it comes from a power plant, which runs on fill in the blank. What's your choice? Hydro, coal, natural gas, nuclear. That's it. You're up. And so what they're doing here, this is the insanity of it, is they are shutting down our source of energy, which of course shuts down the economy. We just saw what happened with the COVID lockdowns. But they have nothing to replace it with. Nothing that will last. This is the insanity of it. It's hurting our cultures because we're better off financially. It is killing third world countries. I'm thinking of the Christian community in Pakistan right now. These people are the poorest of the poor, between the diving Pakistani rupee, the fact that they can't pay the debts they owe to China in yuan because their rupee is diving, the energy crisis and inflationary pressures. These people are slipping below subsistence level. They didn't have enough margin, which, by the way, getting rid of the excess population has always been a goal of the global socialist crowd, the one-worlders.
Yeah, there was a preeminent scientist in Australia's history called Macfarlane Burnet, and he was a virologist, and he won the Nobel Prize for discovering, I think, the T cell and how that worked, the memory of your cells to attack viruses. Anyway,
correct.
He wrote a book called Dominant Mammal, in which he outlined what he was getting from the community and his own thinking. And he said that something like there were 5 crises. The first one was economic destruction due to, environmental destruction due to global war. So in that stage, he was thinking of nuclear. He was also saying overpopulation of the world, which will lead to famine and limited food crisis and all this other stuff. And he also said that, the whole idea that the universe as an ecosystem, or the earth as an ecosystem, can't handle human beings. To me, that seems ridiculous.
But yeah.
Because
and there's a reason why. Go ahead. You tell me your reason. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think Macfarlane Burnett was one of these true believers, but he had this quote. He said, he visited Russia in the 60s, and he said he wouldn't like to live there, but he can't help but admit it would be a community like that the world would have to come to terms with and live in order to address these issues. And so there in the 70s, and the Victorian Parliament, my state in Australia, thought that he was amazing and decided to restrain or restrict wheat exports, increase wheat exports, leaving less for us to consume here. But this whole idea, it seems everywhere I turn, I see Marxism happening. I see Marxism coming in and being involved, whether it's a Christian organization, like I could probably name something like the Gospel Coalition, or anywhere where Christians are encouraged to gather in mass numbers. And the scientific community, you see the Marxism there as well. In China, I talked to Patrick Wood, and he says it's a technocracy. It's not a Marxist government. But what I've seen, I see the synthesis, which is part of Marxist dialectic, everywhere. So maybe China is part technocracy, but the synthesis with Marxism is definitely there. And this, in the Australian government, in the constitutional voice, in climate change, in the ideas of overpopulation, even though the population, as Elon Musk says, is getting to a critical stage, we're just surrounded by this Marxist craziness. It's driving me crazy.
That's why I call it Wocus Pocus, because it's that way. Notice a couple of things that you said in there from that scientist. They all come down to the conclusion that people are bad. Mm-hmm. And it's incredibly hypocritical, because what they do is they reject the Judeo-Christian idea that mankind was created in imago Dei, in the image of God. And they say, no, we just evolved along with everything else. But then they switch, they do a flip when they're hoping nobody's looking, and they say, but mankind is different. Mm. And I always raise my hand and say, no, if mankind is doing it, since we evolved as a part of nature, it is nature doing it. You can't change that horse in the middle of the river. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that's the first hypocrisy. But notice the hatred for mankind that flows along with this. That up on the top, I call it a smiley fist, There's a neat old smiley face right there. But right behind it is real hardcore knuckles and muscle. And if you don't go along with it, you're going to get it. And so there's a hatred for humankind. There's a hatred for anything that gives us freedom. And the irony, whereas he said, well, we'd have to be like the Soviet system to make this work, which is exactly what the World Economic Forum is saying with the Great Reset. Please show me one location where socialism ever worked. It never did. It just resulted in misery for millions of people. And why this thing comes back can only be one reason, and that is it's demonically driven, because it doesn't make any real sense. Mm. And that's what I always come back to from a religious standpoint, because the Bible tells us that the world lies in the power of the evil one, the prince of the power of the air. And what does he do? He deceives the nations. And what looks good is bad. What is bad looks to them to be good. That's why we are where we are. But it always comes down to this. Jacques Cousteau, remember the oceanographer, whose films were well known here. I don't know how well they played out in Australia, but it was a regular TV series here. And he was saying, we just have to get rid of all of these people. They're just creating problems. What's ironic is as societies become more prosperous and more free, they actually self-limit population growth. Whereas the ones that operate under these impoverishment, those are the ones where you have real trouble with overbearing populations. So the answer would seem to be, let's get capitalism to go around the world, because as soon as societies become prosperous, then that all slows down. People stop reproducing. As a matter of fact, most of Europe is below replacement now from the native European population. So it's a very strange world we're in. And of course, they're never going to do that. They're going to push the other way. So you will always find that whatever they say they're doing, they're actually doing the opposite. It always comes down like that.
I think let's switch gears for a second. I want to talk about, because really the ultimate, I think, battle is the fact that many people in the younger generations, not all, but many, are basically, you try and talk to them and it feels like they stick their finger in their ears and go, la, 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 no. And then they'll give you one catchphrase or slogan and they'll say, that is the truth. There's no second sort of supporting evidence. They'll just fluff around.
Right. And if you notice, they do it as they're sliding to the door.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. They're doing it like this.
Yeah.
You know, they're waiting. And what they do is they launch that last salvo and then run out before you have a chance to respond to it. Now, there's a reason for that if you would like to hear that.
Sure, go for it. I'm laughing because this literally happened to me yesterday.
They do. For you and me, I think we have a fairly sound religious worldview. The Germans called it a Weltanschauung, you know, a religious worldview. And if somebody comes to me with a proposition that challenges something I believe, it does not shake my entire worldview. I can sit there, I can debate it, and I don't have to go, no, 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 which we've seen people do this, literally. The millennials today are not stupid, but they are mal-educated. Even if they've gotten college degrees, they're still mal-educated. Because what they were taught to think in is relative. That's the first thing. All the ideas that they have are not rooted in anything absolute. They don't believe in absolutes. Okay, so as a result of that, it's constantly changing, and that creates problems, which means they're always colliding with each other. You've got this view colliding with that view, this group colliding with that group, because why? Everything's relative and constantly changing. So then they have to compartmentalize things and say, this over here is your religious compartment, there's your sex life compartment, over here is your political compartment, and you can have contradictions between these groups. The only unpardonable sin is to open the door between the groups. And then the last trait is that it's consensus driven. They have to tell each other that this really works. It's really good. They're the great, the good, the elite. Their ideas are supreme and based in reason and logic and all of these things. When you come along and even put one little stitch of a contradiction in there, for them that threatens the entire structure that is going to come down like a house of cards, because that's all it is. And that generates inside of them an existential panic, which is why they do what they do. And you either get that they run out, no. You get an explosive reaction. You'll see this even in churches where people think they're Christians, but in reality they're post-millennials. And they will just explode at something, and they go on this. You can actually start your stopwatch. They'll go on this 2.5 to 3 minute rant, in which, by the way, if you're just, don't bother to even interrupt when they do that. Just listen, because they'll contradict themselves 2, 3, or 4 times during the rant because of the way they believe. And that's when you can move in after that, if they don't run out the door. But I even saw a medical doctor one night in our church. Our pastor said, we have the right to bear arms here. And he said, I believe in that right. I believe that's essential to keeping government in check. And this doctor who works in the ER I was getting ready to speak next at this service, and the doctor stood up and he said, no, I've seen all the damage that this does, and we have to get rid of weapons and this and that. And as he's doing it, he's sliding to the door. I kid you not. They just slide to the door. They cannot stand there. And I kept wanting to lean over and say to the pastor, don't let him get out. Bring him down here and have a conversation. Okay? Because you want to demonstrate to the rest of the congregation. That's what you're dealing with. And by the way, it is the mark of cult programming. People who are programmed in a religious cult think and act exactly like these people do, and that is what our public education systems have done, is treat them like that and train them like that. That's why they can't stand up to negative feedback.
Yeah, true. And I think that's becoming more and more obvious, especially after the last 3 years. I think it's amusing, like when, maybe not amusing, that's probably a poor choice of words, but when someone asserts their constitutional, their right to bear arms, and then someone brings a rebuttal to that, talking about the product of what a gun can do, it's like, why do you think the gun is the method by which I'm allowed to defend myself? It stops people. So you telling me that it stops people by killing them or doing damage is actually not really addressing the issue. The issue is the Bill of Rights, I think it's your Second Amendment, says it is necessary to defend or to protect, having a militia to protect the nation, something along those lines. And so that the issue isn't that guns hurt people and kill people. In fact, how could you protect a nation with a non-lethal arm? Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so why do people say we have to find... ultimately, I suppose they're going towards the government will protect us. The government will protect us. And they're saying the reason why you can't have a gun is because you do bad things with it because you're bad. Our government is great and good. They only do good things with guns. So let's give all the guns to the government. And you say, well, what about the criminals? And then they go, la, 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 la.
Right. Not only that, that is the exact opposite of what the founders believed. Mm-hmm. Okay. The founders understood that government is a necessary evil. I'm not anti-government. We need that. Okay. Yeah. Let's face it. But they understood that government was a necessary evil. And they also understood that if the populace was as armed as the militias and the army, that government could never run away with it. So that's the flip side. See, their viewpoints, all of these viewpoints you're talking about come from where? Rousseau and Voltaire and the descendants of the French Revolution, like Karl Marx and Engels and these others. It's a complete inverse from the biblical standpoint that people are just intrinsically evil. So we have a shooting over here, say, for example, and any shooting is tragic, say in a school, and some people get killed. Every weekend in Chicago, an average of 30 people get shot. There are certain places of the city that are just very violent, and nobody flinches. You have far more people killed by automobiles every year, about 50% of which are drunk drivers or people on drugs, than you do through firearms. It's a psychological thing. And frankly, the PTBs know that if they're to bring about this new Marxist utopia, the weapons have got to go.
Yep.
And that's why. So remember, look, for every seeming double standard up here, and you'll notice that the people in what I call the postmodern progressive hocus pocus, they flip and they flop from issue to issue. They'll actually take reverse positions from what they just took before. They'll even take reverse positions in how they live their lives versus what they're preaching. But for every seeming double standard on the surface, there is a unified single standard underneath it. And as David Horowitz says, The outcome desired the issue is always the outcome of the revolution. And they will do anything they have to on the top to make that happen, even if it means flipping and flopping. All the other issues, racism, hit the microphone there, racism, native groups, climate change, environment, you name the issue, it's merely an excuse, a vehicle to propel everything forward.
So do you get to the stage where you sort of just put your foot down and you say, you know what, until we work out this whole Marxist issue in Australia, I don't trust you to change the Constitution at this stage. Even if I don't understand exactly what bad thing you're trying to do, I'm just going to say no.
You better know what you're buying into, because once you do, look at Great Britain. They joined the European Union. Wasn't it 2000 when they had the big celebration at New Year's? They sang Beethoven's Ode to Joy, blah, blah, blah. And they were always told, oh, you can always get out. They're still trying to get out. And how long has it been since we had the Brexit vote?
6 years, I think.
Yeah, 6 years. And they're still trying to get out. That shows you how this is. And people are actually fighting it. Why do we elect people who take an oath to uphold, support, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and then turn right around and try to find a way to end run it? You're supposed to uphold the spirit of it as well. That's what upholding it means. We had a Supreme Court decision because in states like Massachusetts, New York, I think New Jersey, California, Oregon, they make it very difficult for a person to get a concealed weapons license. So difficult, for all practical purposes, most people can't get one. Supreme Court said you can't do that. So that was overturned. Immediately, the attorneys general of those states began to try to figure ways around it. Wait a minute. You're supposed to uphold the Constitution, not find ways around it. There's millennial hocus pocus again. Based on what? Postmodern ideas.
I suppose you could frame a lot of the things that we've been talking about as far as who has authority. For a Christian, God holds ultimate authority, and they tend to be law-abiding citizens. They're trying to live their life in a way that is causing the least amount of conflict. By and large, in Australia, that would probably categorize the Christians fairly well. But now is the time to rock the boat, because probably well overdue to rock the boat, but because there's another authority that has emerged on the scene, and that is the authority of a Marxist deified state. So in Marxist religion, they tend to deify the state in line with what Hegel said and a few other theorists in the past. And so everything they want centers around the government and the state and getting power. And they say it themselves. Right. The whole of the world can be explained in terms of power dynamics. And I think it was Jordan Peterson that said, think carefully. Christians call it a ministry when you're in politics. It's a service. But Marxists call it a position of power. That should tell you something right there. Right. And so what is it going to take? Because I see a lot of the syncretism in the church towards these ideas of Marxism. For instance, my pastor was or is one of the leaders of the Gospel Coalition in Australia. And not to say that he wrote this, but on their website, they say, as part of their core values is, and I'm lifting here out of the section, says anyone who withholds anyone who does not share their wealth cannot have the compassion of God. And it's very clear from the context that they mean money. Now that just scares me, that money and compassion unified like that.
And if you don't do it, there's something wrong with you.
Yes, that's right. You're obviously not as good a Christian as they are. There's this heavy moralizing and guilt tripping and other things like that. And it's bad in America too, with the Southern Baptist Convention and the critical race theory that's going on. And we need to rock the boat.
Francis Schaeffer, it must be 50 years ago now, he did his film series, How Then Shall We Live? It's on YouTube. You can watch it. In his book, it was either in that series or he wrote a number of books I read, The God Who Is There, but also The Great Evangelical Disaster. And he was saying if the church adopts the motif, the thinking, and the language of the world, ultimately it will not be able to stand against the spirit as a witness against the spirit of the time. He is being proven correct by what it is you just said. It's not a matter of sharing the wealth. The question is whether or not you share it because God moves you to help someone, which we have always believed in, my wife and I, as they have need, or is someone choking the heck out of you to get it. That is covetousness. And you cannot justify covetousness on the part of government or churches as being okay. It's a sin. And you can't do it. The other issue is it better, the whole issue is, well, why am I sharing this? Why are these people incapable of generating income for themselves? And a lot of times you discover it's on the part of their sin and their problems. A lot of what we see in homelessness here is due to drug addiction. Why do we have that? These people have no purpose and rooting in their lives. Why is that? The educational system, again, another product of progressives, failed and continues to fail. And so there are lots of causes, but how does my just handing money over help somebody once they have spent the money? And it's questionable if they have spent it wisely. When you have an organization to do the transfer, this even gets more interesting, because as the money goes through the pipeline, whether it's government or big ecclesiastical organizations, a bunch of it just gets siphoned off and into people's pockets. Isn't it strange how that works?
And also money gets used for advertising, for wages and other things. And so if I have $100, and I used to tell my small group this, I used to lead a small group for about 6 years. And I said, if you have $100 in your hand and you've dedicated it to give to somebody to use for Christian charity, do you go up and find yourself a homeless person and say, here, let's have dinner together? Or do you give it to an NGO or some Christian charity and offset it because somehow you're too busy, or you've got this idea that they spend it better? They have overheads. A lot of the Christian NGOs in Australia lobby the government and have been infiltrated by Marxist thinking.
Right.
And so,
and Jesus said, "What? Don't let your right hand know what your left is doing, and give glory to your Father who's in heaven, not give glory to your government who's in Canberra." Right.
Exactly. And also you've got the fact that is God really worried about money? Is God not more worried about you meeting another human being and sharing love rather than money, in the sense of talking and care and giving the gospel? It just really bothers me that something that has a recognizable name like World Vision. Australia has a big World Vision organization, and the Gospel Coalition. These organizations in Christian circles, I can't think of a better word or a different word, but it just feels they're manipulating people.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I won't talk about individual organizations, but I've seen it happen. A lot of these so-called Christian organizations are looking much more like worldly organizations, like a branch office of the United Nations or something like that. We find that in the social services crowd. And rather than saying, what are we going to do in our community to help people, they're spending all their time lobbying either their state parliaments, their national parliament, Congress, legislature, and that. And so in that way, they're just becoming like the world. There's no difference, you know. I really believe that what God called us to do is to do it individually to people or as a local church. And our church does that. We have a lot of people coming in requesting help, and we vet that. You know, we see what the help is. There have been cases in my own life. I remember seeing a homeless man one time. A friend and I had gone to McDonald's for dinner, and I was a heck of a lot younger. And I noticed this guy was rummaging around in the trash can behind the restaurant. And I went up and I said, "Are you hungry?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Just wait here." I went in, bought him a bunch of stuff, came out, said, "Here, have a good dinner. Good night," and just left. Okay? That's one person doing something for another person. My wife and I have taken all sorts of troubled teenagers and other people informally, not even through an adoption process. And in some cases, successfully got them pointed in the right direction. In other cases, it didn't end so well because, you know, everybody has their own individual choice, right? So that's what I believe God calls us to do. He doesn't say, go and start whatever. What did Mother Teresa do in Calcutta? Remember, she was teaching in Albania in a girls' school, and normally those schools have tuition, and it's from the middle to upper class people that send their kids there. And she felt she just really wasn't doing God's will and felt the call to go to Calcutta. And she went and picked up the first dying man that she saw and took him in and cared for him until he died. And then she found another person and another person. That's how we're going to have to do it. Listen, the world is headed into tremendous economic crisis. It's still going to be up to you and me asking the Lord, what do you want me to do today, O King? What can I do to serve you? And he'll say, go over here, see this person, do this. You know, you'll know it in your spirit. You go and do that. When you're done, you say, what else would you like me to do? When you've done that, you've done all you can do to save the world.
I want to tell you just a little story. It's a personal story. As you know, I've listened to Steel on Steel for a long time. I've always had that angst. I'll say that knowing what it means. I've had that angst deep in my spirit, you know. I'm not doing what I need to be doing, and I had no idea what I needed to do. And years just walking around being a Christian, you know, studying my Bible, doing the best. I would collect all types of material and resources and other things like that. It wasn't until towards the end of the first year of lockdown in Victoria, that was particularly harsh with police brutality and just lies and bad stuff, that I looked down at my son, who at the time was, I think, 2, and I had a thought pop into my head from nowhere of when he was older and he would look at me and say, Dad, you were around when all this started. What did you do? And I didn't want to look back into his eyes and say I did nothing. And so I started the Looking Glass. And I don't know how big the reach is, and I don't know how important it is. But for me, doing this, and also anything that else might come in the future, I'm not the one that needs to judge it. I'm not the one that needs to evaluate whether it's successful, even though that might be a smart opportunity, because I don't earn any money from it whatsoever. But I know that going on into the future, I'm going to need information, and I'm going to need a wealth in me, in my heart, in my mind, in my soul. I'm going to need what the Bible calls a wellspring coming out from inside of me. I can't rely on my church, who has in Victoria, they've accepted a safe church model, which is basically feminism, in the sense that trying to protect kids from sexual abuse and other things like that, or domestic abuse. I can't trust the Christian organizations fully. I can't trust my government fully. I need to fill myself up, and so that I can have something to give to other Christians. I reckon it's going to be really hard for Christians who really want to stay faithful to find fellowships. And in Australia, there is far less people as far as density goes than America. What do you think about that? And how do you think church is going to change or needs to change as we're moving into what it seems to be a global Marxist push?
Yeah. When you were talking there, I was thinking of some friends of ours, Canadians, who live in the outback of one of the provinces, and they only had one church in town. And as soon as it began to go off the rails, they said, we can't follow this model. It's not biblical. So they've started a home church, and they've got several families now involved in home churching. This is a very big phenomenon in Europe, where large numbers of young people have come to Christ, but they've never known what it means to be in a big church establishment. They're meeting in homes. And funny, that's where the church originally met, if you remember, is they met in homes for the breaking of the bread, as the book of Acts tells us. The biggest problem you have, I've gotten calls from pastors who are leading their church, but they've told me, I'm alone here. I mean, our church is alone compared to all the other churches out there. And I said, well, I won't use names, obviously, but I said, Pastor, you're not alone, you're just separated. And that's where I believe it's going to be important for some kind of communication that works between these groups, because what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to encourage each other as we see the day drawing near. How are churches doing it in China? That's a good start. What's going on? They estimate now that I think 100,000 Muslims have come to Christ in Iran, and they're all meeting in home churches because they can't go to the official churches. They're not allowed to convert. So they meet in home churches. It's always little people coming up with little solutions, all part of the body of Christ, all looking forward to the day of Christ's return, and maintaining, again, all of the words that Paul uses. If you read it, I was saying this on a radio show earlier, are aggressive words. Contend for the faith, handed off once for all to the saints. Run the race as if to win. Stand, run, defend, act. Stand in the evil day. Every single one of those words is aggressive. And up until now, in the West, in the Anglosphere, we haven't had to do that. This is all new.
Yeah,
Okay.
In the churches, especially in the more denominational churches, instead of words like stand, contend, fight, walk, do these things, the churches are saying, stop, sit down, be quiet, listen to me, do as I say.
Ignore those churches.
Exactly.
Okay. Richard Vornbraun said there are two types of people in churches. Remember, he spent 14 years in prison under the Soviets. And he said there are two types of people, those who think they are Christians and those who really are. And the only way you can tell the difference is not by what they say, but by what they do in a time of trial. That's because that puts the screws on the church. And for the people who just sort of do what they do, they cannot stand during this time. Standing requires knowing what you believe and maintaining that belief. Here is a call for the patience and the faith of the saints, we're told in Revelation. By your patience, your endurance, Jesus said, you will win your lives. And you can't do that in this wishy-washy world that the Western churches have given us. And if that's an extreme position, okay, I guess it is. So was John the Baptist.
Yeah, it's funny. John the Baptist is called the greatest prophet by Jesus.
Right.
And he was out in the desert eating locusts and wild honey. And as far as I know, he did no miracles or anything like that. So I found out from Mike Heiser that out in the desert is where all the evil spirits are thought to be. And so
in the Islamic world, they call them the jinn.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
That's where right.
And so, when you look at John the Baptist, we haven't seen him as a great spiritual warfare general. But because he went out into the desert, the people are like, wow, that's where all this, like, the spiritual evil is, and he survived, and he's come back telling that we need to repent and get baptized. We better do it because he knows what the evil spirits are doing. And he survived. And I just think, like what Mike Heiser says, we as Christians, we need to get a grip and to really rediscover the supernatural worldview of the Bible, because the amazing thing is, in the secular world, in the government world, spirituality is coming right back around. And this is coming right back around to obvious spiritual warfare.
And the only time the religiousness and the spirituality is rejected is when it's Christian spirituality.
That's right.
All the other spiritualities, pantheism, are accepted. And I know what you're talking about. You have deserts there in Australia. On Christmas Day many years ago, I was visiting my in-laws in Arizona, and afternoon I was hiking up around what's called Superstition Mountain, which was considered sacred by the natives. And it was late afternoon. I was by myself at the base of these sheer rock cliffs. And all of a sudden, I got the spookiest feeling you could ever believe. And I went, wow, I see why they saw that. Because it just seems to be there. You could feel it,
Yeah. Look, I really appreciate all the time you've given me. I just want to ask one more question of you, John. And that is, in the looking glass, the people that see this, there's probably a good majority who are Christians, but there's probably also a good number of people who are not Christians. And if you had the opportunity to talk to someone who would listen to our conversation and who was also sharing our anxiety about what's going on in the future, if you had the opportunity to talk to them, what do you feel like would be important to say?
It would be important that they understand that God saw all of this coming. All right. He is sovereign. He knew all of this would happen since the beginning of the world. So getting in the right place with that God, the God who made the universe and all of its power and glory itself, is important. But number two, that provides the guidance that you need to get through your life and to give you those spiritual and emotional tools that you need to do it. That's why that is important. Everybody else will be, the more it gets worse, everybody will be flopping around. Remember, they have no reference points. They're standing on sand. But Jesus said you have to stand on rock so that when the storms come, you'll still be there after the storm goes. And the third thing is, we're only here for a little while, Joshua. We come and we go. Don't waste the time. Understand that every day is a gift. Make use of it. You don't know how much time God has allotted to you, but what you do here will affect what you do for all eternity.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate your time. And I really loved Steel on Steel, and I really hope that you haven't hung up the mic. I know you'll find something to do. You're a rock the boat kind of guy.
It's a steelonsteel.com. Everything's open now. There's no subscription. We're archived back to 2003 or 2001, along with talks I've given many years ago. You can see what I was thinking 20 years ago about the future. And we also have a Facebook page, Praying for Persecuted Christians. It's really important to pray for our brothers and sisters who are suffering.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks so much, John. And you take care of yourself and have a really good afternoon.
God bless. Be safe.